You know what I miss most? Someone remembering how I take my coffee." The old man's voice came out soft and almost apologetic as he eased himself into his usual corner booth at Rosie's Diner, his hands trembling slightly while he unfolded the newspaper in the same careful way he did every morning, more out of habit than actual reading these days. 28-year-old Mara Brennan, halfway between tables with the coffee pot in her hand, stopped mid-step as his words slipped under her practiced smile and cracked something tender in her chest. She had been waitressing here for 6 years, ever since her mother's medical bills had swallowed her college fund and any plans she'd had for a different future. And in that time she had become very good at hearing the things people didn't say out loud. "2 sugars, no cream," she answered gently as she poured, setting the cup in front of him with quiet precision, adding that he always folded the sports section first, even though he ended up reading the obituaries. Walter Finch looked up sharply at that, faded blue eyes suddenly bright with unshed tears, and he breathed out a disbelieving little laugh as he told her that she noticed, as if the fact of being seen at all was more startling than the coffee itself. Mara just shrugged and told him that everyone deserved to be seen, Mr. Finch, and that had been 4 months ago, long enough for him to become another steady beat in the rhythm of her days. Every morning at exactly 7:15, he shuffled through the door in a cardigan a size too large and shoes polished with care that didn't match their age, ordering the same modest breakfast. Toast, scrambled eggs, coffee, always paying his small bill, and always leaving a $5 tip on $8, like it was a promise he refused to break. She learned his story the way you learn a season's weather, in fragments that kept returning until they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. Dorothy, his wife of nearly 50 years, had died 3 years earlier, and the house they had shared had grown too quiet, too big, and too full of echoes. His son had moved to Seattle and gotten lost in deadlines and airports, always too busy to do more than send a rushed "next week dad" text that rarely turned into a call. And his grandson managed to visit once or twice a year at best, more interested in his phone than in the man sitting across from him. Walter told Mara one morning, voice steady but hollow, that he didn't blame them, that people had lives to live, and he was just an old man stuck between chapters, waiting for the epilogue to show up. And something in the way he said it made Mara reach across the counter and wrap her fingers around his weathered hand, telling him that maybe he was not at the end of his story at all, maybe he was just stepping into a new chapter that hadn't been written yet. So she started doing small things that felt like nothing, and also like everything. She set aside a copy of the newspaper before the breakfast rush could tear it apart. She made sure his booth stayed open even when the diner was packed. She listened when he wanted to talk and sat in comfortable quiet when he did not. On his birthday, which he had mentioned exactly one time in passing, she brought out a slice of warm apple pie with a single crooked candle stuck in the middle, singing softly while the grill hissed in the background, and Walter had wept openly without shame, whispering that she was the only person who had remembered the date at all. As the weeks rolled on, she also noticed the things he didn't talk about, how his hands shook a little more each morning when he lifted the cup, how he sometimes repeated a story twice in one visit, how a cane appeared beside the booth one day and never left, how his clothes began to hang off him like they belonged to someone larger, and how his smiles took more effort to reach his eyes. Then, on a Tuesday that should have looked like every other Tuesday, Walter didn't come. Mara felt the gap in the morning like a skipped heartbeat, a silence where something solid was supposed to be. After her shift, she found his address in the phone book, a stubbornly old-fashioned resource in a digital world, and took a bus to the small, tidy house that looked like it had once held laughter and now held only careful order. Walter answered the door in flannel pajamas and an expression that mixed embarrassment with bone-deep exhaustion. He admitted he had fallen, that nothing seemed broken but everything felt heavy and worn, and that he was so very tired, And the way he said her name, "So tired, Mara," told her how close he was to simply giving up. From that day, she began stopping by after work with groceries tucked under one arm, and his prescriptions in a brown paper bag, reading the paper aloud when his eyes blurred, straightening the mail, checking the fridge, making sure he took his pills, and ignoring the sighs from her manager who complained about her shorter shifts and dwindling availability. When Walter finally asked her one evening why she did it, why she kept coming when she didn't owe him anything, and he had nothing to offer in return, Mara tucked his blanket more snugly around his legs and blinked back her own tears, telling him that someone needed to show up, that his life mattered, that kindness was not supposed to be something we handed out only when it fit neatly into our schedules. It was, she believed, the price of calling ourselves human. 3 weeks later, Walter died quietly in his sleep, and Mara learned the news when a hospice nurse called to say that he had listed her as his emergency contact. She stood in the hot, clattering kitchen of the diner and cried for 20 solid minutes, grieving for a man who had sat in her section for months and somehow become family without either of them ever naming it that way. The funeral was small and stark in its simplicity. Mara, the hospice nurse, and 3 neighbors who knew Walter as the man who waved politely from his porch but had never been invited inside. Just as the service was ending, the church doors swung open, and a man in an expensive suit hurried up the aisle, breathless and glued to his phone, announcing that he was Marcus Finch, Walter's grandson, and asking where everyone was. Mara turned to look at him, anger and sorrow tangling in her chest, and told him that he was looking at everyone, that this small cluster of people was all his grandfather had left at the end. Marcus's face tightened as he stammered something about work and deadlines, and Mara, voice shaking but calm, told him that Walter had died feeling alone, waiting for someone to remember that he existed. Marcus left without another word, and Mara assumed that this too was an ending, sad, inevitable, and far too common. 2 weeks later, Marcus walked into the diner with 2 lawyers in sober suits at his side, and Mara's stomach dropped as she imagined legal threats, bitter fights over a house, and accusations she had neither the energy nor the money to fight. One of the lawyers addressed her by name and said they needed to speak about Walter Finch's will, and her hands shook as she insisted that she did not want anything, that all she had ever wanted was for him to feel like he mattered. Marcus stepped forward then, and she saw something unexpected in his eyes, not anger, but a raw, unsettled shame. He told her that his grandfather had left her the house, yes, but that was not the only reason they were there. Walter had also left him a letter, and the lawyer believed it should be read with Mara present. They took their usual corner booth, Walter's booth now, and the lawyer slid a yellowed envelope across the table. Marcus's hands trembled as he broke the seal and began to read aloud, his grandfather's careful handwriting turning into a voice that filled the space between them. Walter wrote that if Marcus was reading those words, then he was already gone, and that he did not blame Marcus for being busy because life was demanding, and he was just an old man, but that there was someone Marcus needed to know about. He told him about Mara Brennan, the waitress who made $8 an hour plus tips, who had no extra money or time to spare, and yet had given him everything that truly mattered: her patience, her attention, her small acts of thoughtfulness, her stubborn insistence that he was still visible. She had remembered his coffee order and his birthday, saved his booth, listened to stories others would have tuned out, and had seen him when the rest of the world, including his own family, had let him blur into the background. He explained that he was leaving her the house because she had given him something more valuable than property. She had given him dignity in his last chapter, and he wanted Marcus to learn from her example. Success, he wrote, meant very little if it came at the cost of loving people poorly, and wealth meant nothing if you could not remember how someone took their coffee. He urged Marcus to be better than he had taught him to become more like Mara. By the time Marcus reached the end, His face had crumpled, and tears were sliding down his cheeks unchecked as he looked at Mara with a mixture of devastation and gratitude, admitting that he had been so focused on building a career and trying to make his grandfather proud on paper that he had forgotten to actually be with him in the moments that mattered. Mara reached across the table, mirroring the gesture she had once made to Walter, and told Marcus through her own tears that his grandfather had known he was loved, that he just needed to feel it show up more often. Marcus, voice barely above a whisper, asked her to teach him, to show him how to see people the way she had seen Walter, how to notice the small things that made a person feel real and valued. Over the months that followed, something neither of them had planned slowly unfolded. Marcus began coming to the diner regularly, not to rush through a meal or have a quick business meeting, but to sit, listen, and learn. He chatted with the regulars, picked up their orders by memory, asked about their lives, and actually stayed long enough to hear the answers. He cut back on his work hours, started volunteering at the senior center Walter had once mentioned but never visited because he had been too proud to admit I was lonely, and slowly the shape of his life shifted. Mara and Marcus's connection grew from shared grief into shared purpose, not a romance hurried into existence to fill an absence, but a partnership built on the mutual decision to honor Walter by changing what they did with their days. Together, they turned Walter's house into a community space, renovating the rooms into warm, welcoming areas where older adults could gather for a cup of coffee, a conversation, or simply the relief of being somewhere they were expected and welcomed. They named it Walter's Corner, and from the first day it opened, it became the kind of place he had always deserved, one where people were called by name, where their stories were asked for and remembered, where someone kept track of how they liked their coffee and whether they preferred crosswords or card games. One year after Walter's passing, Mara stood at the grand opening, watching the once quiet house fill with laughter, shuffling footsteps, and the soft hum of voices. The rooms now crowded with people who had spent years feeling like they had faded into the background until someone chose to lean in and see them again. Marcus stood beside her, his fingers intertwined with hers, and asked softly if she thought his grandfather knew what he had set in motion, whether he understood that his loneliness and her kindness had become the seed for all of this. Mara, eyes shining, answered that she believed he did know, that he had always suspected one act of kindness could change everything. He had just needed someone to prove it to him. An elderly woman approached Mara then, cradling a coffee cup and smiling shyly. She asked how Mara took her coffee, and when Mara answered, 2 sugars, no cream, the woman nodded and said she would remember that because everyone deserved to have someone remember those little details. In that small exchange, something settled in Mara's heart, and she finally understood what Walter had been trying to explain that very first morning in Rosie's diner, when he said he missed someone remembering his coffee. None of them were here to be remembered by history books, granite plaques, or the size of their bank accounts. They were here to be remembered by one another in the quiet, ordinary ways that stitched lives together. Through daily rituals, familiar orders, shared booths, and the simple act of noticing another human being and saying, without needing to say it out loud, "You matter, you are not invisible, and someone out there remembers exactly how you take your coffee." If this story touched your heart or reminded you of someone you need to check on, please like the video, share it with a friend, subscribe to the channel for more long, emotional stories, and let me know in the comments whose coffee order you'll remember a little more carefully from today.